When I needed them most, they turned their backs. When I asked for help, they told me, "Figure it out yourself." So I did, and in the end, it was their names I erased. My name is Margaret Lane. I'm 74 years old, and I've lived in the same quiet town in Ohio for most of my life. For 49 years, I was a wife to a good man, Harold, who passed away 6 years ago. Together, we built a home, raised 2 children, and believed in the old-fashioned idea that family meant everything. I thought that if I worked hard, loved deeply, and gave selflessly, the loyalty would come back around when I needed it. But life has a way of teaching lessons the hard way. When Harold died, my world felt smaller, emptier. The house we had poured our energy into became too big for just me. Every corner carried echoes of him, his chair in the living room, his boots by the door, his laughter that used to fill Sunday mornings. I leaned on our children, Emily and Robert, in those early days, thinking grief might bring us closer. Instead, it showed me just how far they'd drifted away. I remember one afternoon clearly. I had slipped in the garden. Nothing dramatic, but enough to twist my ankle badly. It was swollen and painful, and I struggled to get inside. I called Emily first, my daughter. She sighed, said she was too busy with the kids' soccer practice, and suggested I put some ice on it. Robert, my son, didn't answer the first 3 times. When he finally picked up, his voice was impatient, as if I had interrupted something important. His words cut me sharper than the pain in my ankle. "Mum, you'll have to figure it out yourself. I can't keep running over every time you need something." It wasn't the words alone. It was the tone, cold, detached, as though the years I spent raising them had faded into some inconvenient blur. That night, sitting with my ankle wrapped in a dish towel filled with melting ice cubes, I stared at the ceiling and thought about Harold. He used to say, "A family's true measure isn't in their words, but in what they do when you call." By that measure, mine had failed me. It wasn't just the ankle. There were other moments too, small in isolation, but heavy together. The light fixture in the kitchen buzzed and flickered for months, because Robert never found the time to change it, though he lived only 20 minutes away. Emily promised she'd help me sort through Harold's old workshop, but always cancelled at the last minute. They didn't see me as someone worth showing up for anymore. I was just an obligation. I tried not to let bitterness take root, but loneliness is a dangerous companion. You start questioning yourself. Am I asking for too much? Am I being a burden? Yet deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't asking for the world. I was asking for the kind of care I had once given freely without hesitation, when they were small and helpless and needed me. There were evenings when the silence in the house pressed so heavily against me that I'd turn on the radio just to hear another human voice. I would make a single cup of tea, sit at the kitchen table, and wonder how everything had gone so wrong. My children, my own flesh and blood, seemed to vanish when I needed them. Still, I held on to hope. I thought maybe it was just the busyness of their lives, the distraction of careers and families of their own. Surely, I told myself, when something truly serious happened, they would be there. Surely the love I had poured into them all their lives still counted for something. But that hope began to wither the more I saw the pattern. They wanted the holiday dinners, the gifts, the traditions I kept alive. But when it came to the ordinary burdens of aging, the rides to appointments, the small repairs, even just a phone call to check in, I was left to manage on my own. And so, the seed of something began to form inside me. It wasn't revenge, not yet. It was clarity, a recognition that blood may tie people together, but loyalty is proven in actions. I didn't know then how far things would go, or how the words, "figure it out yourself," would return to haunt them in ways they never expected. But I knew this. The day would come when they assumed I had left everything, the house, the savings, the heirlooms, in their hands. And when that day came, they would finally understand what it meant to be left with nothing. That day, as it turned out, would be the reading of my will. When I think back to the years when Emily and Robert were young, I can still feel the warmth of their little hands clutching mine. Our home was always full of noise. Harold hammering away in the garage, the kids chasing each other through the hallways, me in the kitchen trying to cook dinner while keeping everyone from breaking something. It wasn't always easy, but it was real. We were a family. We were supposed to always be there for each other. That's why it stung so sharply to see how quickly that bond unraveled as the years passed. It wasn't one single event. It was 1,000 tiny cuts. The first real sign came after Harold's funeral. I remember standing in the empty living room, the guests all gone, flowers starting to wilt, and I felt like the silence itself was crushing me. I had thought my children would stay the night, maybe even a few days, to help me adjust. Instead, Emily gave me a quick hug, said she had to get back to the kids, and left. Robert stood awkwardly in the doorway and muttered something about a big week at work, and then, just like that, they were gone. I sat there with Harold's folded flag in my lap, staring at the shadows on the wall, realizing that grief was a lonely road I would be walking mostly alone. At first, I tried to excuse them. They were busy, I told myself. They had families, jobs, responsibilities. But then came the little requests, moments when I reached out, not for comfort, but for the kind of help any child should gladly give. There was the time the furnace stopped working in the dead of winter. I called Robert, shivering under blankets, and asked if he could come take a look or recommend someone. His response was short. "Mum, I'm not a handyman. Call a professional." It wasn't the words themselves. It was the dismissal. No pause, no concern, not even a promise to check in later to see if I'd managed. Then there was the time Emily came over for coffee. I mentioned gently that I was having trouble carrying laundry up and down the basement stairs. She barely looked up from her phone before saying, "Well, Mum, you're not getting any younger. Maybe you should hire someone to help around the house." I forced a laugh, but inside it felt like a punch. It wasn't advice. It was avoidance. Each time the sting grew sharper. Each time I felt a little more invisible. I still tried to be present for them. I baked cookies for Emily's kids, went to their school plays, mailed birthday cards with cash tucked inside. I sent Robert messages wishing him luck before his big presentations at work. I gave and gave and gave, but when I needed even the smallest thing in return, there was always some excuse. It's a strange feeling, to realize that the people you once would have walked through fire for now see you as a burden. I began to notice the shift in their tone. Conversations became shorter, almost rushed. Phone calls ended with a sigh if I lingered too long. I wasn't Mum anymore. I was an obligation on their checklist. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table after Emily had stopped by. She had left in a hurry, brushing off my request to help clean out Harold's workshop. I stared at the worn wood of the table, running my hand over the scratches Harold had left there from years of fixing everything under the sun. He had been the glue, I realized. He had been the one they looked up to, the one who kept the family orbit steady, and without him, they drifted, away from me, away from each other. I remember whispering into the quiet room, "What happened to us?" But the only answer was the hum of the refrigerator. The loneliness deepened. My days became a blur of routines, making tea, reading the paper, tending the garden. The world outside kept spinning, but mine felt like it had slowed to a crawl. I began to wonder if this was all I had left, fading into the background, while the very children I had raised barely noticed. It wasn't just neglect, it was erasure. Piece by piece they were erasing me from their lives. And though I told myself to endure it quietly, a seed of resolve was already planting itself deep inside me, because if they didn't see me now, they would certainly see me later. It was a Thursday afternoon when the world shifted for me in a way I hadn't expected. I had just returned from the grocery store, the trunk of my car loaded with bags that felt heavier than they used to. My wrist still ached from the old sprain, and my knees reminded me with every step that age was catching up to me. I pulled one bag out, then another, but halfway through, I had to pause and lean against the car. The weight wasn't just physical, it was emotional. I thought of calling Robert or Emily, but the memory of their voices echoed in my head. Figure it out yourself. So I tried. I dragged 2 more bags to the porch, breathing hard, when I heard a voice behind me. "Need a hand, Mrs. Lane?" It was my neighbor, Claire. She had moved in 3 years earlier, a single mother in her 40s with a teenage son. We weren't close, but she always waved when she saw me in the yard. I forced a smile, embarrassed to be caught struggling. "Oh, I'll manage," I said automatically. She didn't listen. She picked up the remaining bags, carried them inside, and set them gently on the kitchen counter. There, no sense proving how strong you are when someone's standing right here. It was such a simple gesture, but it stopped me cold. I had grown so used to being brushed off that I'd forgotten what it felt like for someone to show up without hesitation. I must have looked stunned, because she gave me a small smile and added, "My mum always said, never let pride keep you from accepting kindness." That night, as I unpacked the groceries, her words echoed in my mind. I thought of Emily, glued to her phone as she brushed past me, and Robert, always too busy for even a simple errand. And then I thought of Claire, who had no obligation to me at all, but had stepped in without being asked. It reminded me of something Harold used to say: blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. At the time, I thought it was just one of his old sayings, the kind he'd pull out during dinner conversations. But now, it landed with the weight of truth. The days that followed proved that moment wasn't a fluke. Claire began checking in on me, not in a smothering way, but in small, thoughtful gestures. She'd wave from her porch and ask if I needed anything from the store. Sometimes, she'd bring over extra soup or bread, saying she made too much. Her son even shoveled my driveway one winter morning before I'd even woken up. These weren't grand gestures. They were reminders that I mattered to someone, that I wasn't invisible. Meanwhile, my own children became more and more distant. Emily called only when she wanted me to watch the kids, and even then, she dropped them off like parcels, barely saying thank you. Robert rarely called at all, unless it was near the holidays when he wanted to make sure I'd still host dinner. I began to see a pattern so clear, it was painful. The people I thought would stand by me, my own children, had chosen distance and indifference, and the person I least expected, a neighbor, practically a stranger, had shown me more care than either of them. One evening, I sat with Claire on the porch as the sun set. She told me about her struggles, raising a teenager alone, balancing bills and long work hours. Yet she laughed easily, and her eyes held a warmth I hadn't felt in years. I realized that while she had little in terms of wealth, she had something my own children lacked: presence. It was then that the thought began to take shape in my mind, a thought I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. If they can't be there for me in the small things, why should I trust them with the big things? I didn't say it aloud, not even to Claire, but it nestled itself deep inside me, a quiet truth I couldn't ignore. That night, I took out Harold's old ledger book, the one where we had kept track of our savings, investments, and property notes. Running my fingers over his handwriting, I remembered his steady voice. "We worked hard for this, Maggie. Make sure it goes where it'll be valued." I closed the book with trembling hands, a new resolve coursing through me. For the first time since Harold's death, I didn't feel helpless. I felt clear. I knew then that the future of everything we had built together, our home, our savings, our legacy, would not go to those who turned their backs on me. The first pieces of my plan had fallen into place. If there had been even a flicker of genuine care from Emily or Robert, maybe things would have been different. Maybe my heart would have softened, and I would have chalked their distance up to life's busyness. But instead, they showed me exactly where their priorities lay. It started small, almost disguised as casual conversation. One Sunday, Emily came over with her children. We sat in the living room while the kids played with Harold's old chess set. She looked around the house, her eyes lingering a little too long on the antique clock Harold's grandfather had built. "Mum," she said lightly, "when the time comes, I'd really like that clock. It would look perfect in our dining room." The way she said it made my stomach turn. When the time comes. Not someday, not after you're ready, but as though I were already gone, my possessions already scattered like spoils. I smiled tightly, swallowing the sting in my throat, and simply nodded. Not long after, Robert stopped by. He was restless, tapping his fingers on the arm of Harold's chair. "You know, Mum," he said, "the housing market's crazy right now. If this place ever goes on the market, it would fetch a fortune. Emily and I could split it, maybe even pay off our mortgages." I froze. He didn't say if you sell it, or if you ever decide to downsize. He said when this place goes on the market, as if my home, the one Harold and I had poured our sweat into, was nothing more than an asset waiting to be cashed in. I forced a small laugh and said, "Well, Robert, I'm still living here, you know." He chuckled, almost dismissively. "Of course, Mum. I just meant down the line. You know, it'll be good for all of us. All of us. The words echoed bitterly, because what he really meant was good for him and Emily. My well-being wasn't part of the calculation. It didn't stop there. At family dinners, I began to notice their whispers. Emily leaned toward Robert once and said, "You can have the garage. Dad's tools would just clutter my place." Robert shrugged, replying, "Fine, but I get the coin collection." They weren't dividing responsibilities. They were dividing me, piece by piece, like vultures circling a body not yet cold. I sat through it in silence, sipping tea, nodding when spoken to, but inside, the decision I had begun forming grew stronger. Their greed wasn't just insulting, it was clarifying. They weren't here for me. They were here for what I would leave behind. One evening after they left, I sat at the kitchen table with Harold's ledger open again. My hand hovered over the page, trembling slightly, and I whispered into the empty room, "You were right, Harold. Loyalty matters more than blood." The next morning, I called my lawyer, Mr. Avery. His voice was calm and steady, the way it always was. "Mrs. Lane," he said, "I'll set aside time for you tomorrow. Bring whatever documents you want updated." Walking into his office the next day, I felt both nervous and empowered. The walls were lined with heavy books, the air smelling faintly of leather and ink. He gestured for me to sit, and I handed him the folder containing my old will. "I want to make some changes," I told him. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Changes?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "My children, they've made it clear they're not concerned with me, only with what I leave behind. I don't want my life's work in their hands." "And who would you like it to go to?" he asked gently. I thought of Claire, her kind smile, her unexpected help, the way she treated me with dignity rather than impatience. "To someone who actually showed up when I needed them," I said firmly. "To someone who proved loyalty." Mr. Avery didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, uncapped his pen, and began drafting the new document. Every stroke of his pen felt like a release, like I was reclaiming my dignity in the face of their greed. When it was done, I signed my name with a steady hand. My children's names were gone, erased from the legacy they had taken for granted. As I left his office, the sunlight hit my face, and for the first time in years, I felt free. I knew they would never see it coming, and when the moment arrived, they would finally understand the weight of their words. "Figure it out yourself." I had figured it out, just not in the way they expected. It was a cold January morning when I felt the first sharp pang in my chest. I had been shoveling a thin layer of snow from the porch steps, moving slower than I used to, when suddenly the world tilted. I gripped the railing, breath shallow, heart hammering like a trapped bird. For a moment, I thought, this is it. This is how it ends. Alone on the porch, clutching at air. I managed to make it inside and sit down, trembling. My hands shook as I reached for the phone. Instinctively, I dialed Emily first. The line rang, then clicked. "Mum, I'm in the middle of something," she said, her voice curt. I don't feel right," I whispered. "My chest, it hurts. Could you—" There was a pause, then a sigh. "Call 911, Mum. I can't just drop everything. You'll figure it out." The line went dead. I stared at the receiver in disbelief. My daughter, my own flesh and blood, had brushed me off in what might have been the most terrifying moment of my life. Next, I tried Robert. He picked up on the second ring, his voice already irritated. "What now, Mum? I'm not well. Please. I need help." "Seriously? I've got a meeting in 10 minutes. Call an ambulance. That's what they're for." And then he, too, hung up. My chest still ached, though less severely. My hands shook, not just from fear, but from the realization that in my darkest moment, I had been abandoned, not by strangers, but by the very children I had carried, fed, and loved into adulthood. I dialed 911. Within minutes, paramedics were at my door, calm and efficient. They lifted me gently onto a stretcher, their voices firm but kind. At the hospital, doctors ran tests. It wasn't a full heart attack, just a scare. Angina, they called it, a warning sign. But the greater wound was not physical. It was emotional, carved deep by neglect, sharper than any scalpel. When I woke in the hospital bed later that evening, I half expected to see Emily or Robert sitting beside me, guilt on their faces. Instead, I saw Claire, my neighbor, her hands folded in her lap. "I came as soon as I heard," she said softly. "The paramedics left the door open. I locked it for you. I brought your things." She gestured to the bag she'd packed for me. Robe, slippers, even my reading glasses. I blinked back tears. "You didn't have to." "Of course I did," she said firmly. "You'd have done the same for me." And she was right. That was the point. Family, or the people who chose to be family, showed up when it mattered. My children hadn't. Over the next 2 days, as I rested in the hospital, I waited for a call, a visit, a text. Nothing came. Not from Emily, not from Robert. The silence was deafening. By the time I returned home, escorted kindly by Claire, something inside me had hardened. The doubt, the hesitation, the tiny voice that still whispered, "Maybe they'll change." It was gone. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, staring at the new will Mr. Avery had prepared, and I felt an odd sense of calm. There would be no turning back. I had given them every chance. I had forgiven their small failures, excused their neglect, overlooked their greed. But this was the breaking point. I thought of Harold then, his steady voice echoing in my memory. "Don't leave your legacy in the hands of those who'll squander it, Maggie. Leave it where it'll mean something." So I did. I signed the final copy of the will with the steady hand, sealing their fate with ink. The irony wasn't lost on me. When I had asked them for help, they had told me to figure it out myself, and so I had, deciding quietly but firmly that when the time came, they would inherit nothing. They wouldn't know it yet, of course. They would only discover the truth at the reading of my will. And when that moment came, it wouldn't just be about money or property. It would be about justice. I folded the document carefully and placed it back in the envelope. The storm was coming, and for once, I didn't dread it. The day of the will reading arrived with the weight of inevitability. I had imagined it so many times in my head, the looks on their faces, the murmurs of the relatives, the moment when the truth would finally drop like a stone into still water. And now, here it was. Mr. Avery, my lawyer, had arranged everything at his office, a quiet building downtown with heavy oak doors and polished floors, the kind of place where every sound seemed to echo with formality. Emily and Robert arrived together, their expressions taut with expectation. Emily's designer bag swung at her side as she whispered something to Robert, both of them smirking. Robert's jaw was set in that familiar way, confident, almost smug, as though he already knew what was coming. Behind them came a handful of extended relatives, cousins and in-laws, who had little to do with me in life, but now seemed curious enough to show up for the reading. And then, quietly, in the back of the room, sat Claire. She looked out of place among the polished suits and glittering jewelry, but her presence steadied me. Mr. Avery began without ceremony. He adjusted his glasses, shuffled a few papers, and cleared his throat. "We are here today to review the last will and testament of Mrs. Margaret Lane." The room settled into silence. I sat in the corner, my hands folded tightly, listening as my life was laid out in words I had chosen carefully. To my daughter, Emily, and my son, Robert. Mr. Avery paused, his eyes flicking to them. Their bodies leaned forward in unison, ready to hear about the house, the accounts, the heirlooms. "I leave nothing." The words dropped into the room like a thunderclap. Emily's mouth fell open. Robert's face drained of colour. Whispers erupted among the relatives. Mr. Avery continued, his tone even. "This decision is not made in anger, but in truth. My children have shown me, through years of neglect and indifference, that they value only what I can leave behind, not the mother who lived before them. When I asked for help, I was told to figure it out myself, and so I have." The letter I had written was unfolded, the paper crisp, my handwriting steady. Mr. Avery read aloud. "I asked for help with groceries. I was told to figure it out myself. I asked for help with a doctor's visit. I was told to figure it out myself. When I called, frightened, clutching my chest, I was told to figure it out myself. So I did. I figured out who my true family was, and it was not my children." Gasps rippled through the room. Emily's face twisted in disbelief, her voice sharp as a blade. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" Robert slammed his hand on the table. "This isn't right. We're her children." But Mr. Avery remained calm. "The will is legal, signed, and witnessed. Your mother's wishes are final." He read on, To my neighbour, Claire Johnson, who showed me more loyalty and compassion than my own children, I leave my home, my savings, and the heirlooms of my family. She did not ask for these things, nor expect them, but she earned them in the ways that matter most, through presence, kindness, and love. Claire's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, tears welling. She looked utterly shocked, as though the weight of the inheritance was too heavy to even comprehend. Emily stood abruptly, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You manipulated her? You turned her against us?" Claire shook her head, her voice barely audible. I never asked for anything. I just helped," Mr. Avery interjected firmly. "The will was updated months before Mrs. Lane's passing health scare. I oversaw it myself. There was no coercion, no pressure. These were her independent, deliberate decisions." The room erupted into chaos. Relatives whispering, Emily shouting, Robert pacing furiously. But I sat still, calm, in a way I hadn't felt in years. For once, their words didn't pierce me. Their anger, their disbelief. It wasn't mine to carry anymore. They had made their choices long ago, when they told me to figure it out myself, and now they were living with the result. The moment Mr. Avery finished speaking, the room fractured like glass under pressure. Emily was the first to erupt. She shoved her chair back with such force that it scraped loudly against the polished floor. "This is unbelievable," she cried, her voice trembling with rage. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? By giving it all to a stranger?" I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap. Everything in me wanted to answer, but I knew this wasn't my time to speak. The truth was already written into every word Mr. Avery had read aloud. Robert's reaction was different, but no less venomous. He stood, pacing like a caged animal, running his hand through his hair. His voice was low, almost a growl. "This can't be legal. We'll contest it. We'll take it to court. There's no way she—" He stopped, catching himself, then jabbed a finger toward Claire. "She put you up to this, didn't she? You fed her lies until she turned against us." Claire, sitting pale and shaken, shook her head slowly. "No, I never asked for anything. I only helped when she needed it." But Emily wasn't listening. She leaned across the table, her face flushed with fury. "You don't deserve a dime. You're nothing but a neighbor. We're her children. Blood should mean something." Mr. Avery's voice cut through the chaos like a gavel, calm, firm, undeniable. "Blood does not override intent. Your mother made her wishes clear, and the law supports them. Contesting this will only waste your time and money." The room fell into a tense silence. I watched Emily sink back into her chair, her eyes brimming with tears, not of grief, but of outrage. Robert stood stiffly, fists clenched, his face a mask of betrayal. They looked less like children who had lost a mother and more like heirs denied their prize. It was then I felt a strange mix of sorrow and release. Sorrow because these were my children, the ones I had carried, raised, and loved with every fiber of my being. Release because finally I no longer had to pretend. I no longer had to excuse their neglect or make excuses for their absence. The truth was laid bare for all to see. Mr. Avery folded the papers neatly, tapping them into order. "Unless there are further questions, that concludes the reading." Robert muttered something under his breath and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. Emily lingered for a moment, her eyes boring into me with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "You'll regret this," she spat. Then she turned sharply on her heel and followed her brother. The relatives, suddenly uncomfortable, murmured excuses and slipped out one by one. Their curiosity satisfied, they had no reason to linger. That left only Claire and me. She sat frozen, her eyes still wide, her hands trembling slightly. Finally, she whispered, "I don't understand. Why would you— Why me?" I turned to her, my voice steady, though my heart swelled with emotion. "Because when I called for help, you answered. When I needed someone, you came. You didn't do it for money or out of obligation. You did it because you cared. That means more to me than blood ever did." Her eyes filled with tears. "But it's too much, Margaret. The house, the savings. I could never—" I reached across the table, placing my hand gently over hers. "It's not too much. It's exactly right. You gave me dignity when others gave me excuses. That is worth everything." For the first time in years, I felt peace settle over me. The storm had passed, leaving clarity in its wake. My children's anger, their threats, their accusations, it was noise. The truth was simple. I had chosen where my legacy would go, and it was exactly where it belonged. As Claire helped me gather my things, I glanced once more at the empty doorway where Emily and Robert had stood, demanding, shouting, furious. A part of me grieved for the family I had lost long before this day, but a greater part of me felt free. Free of their entitlement, free of their coldness, free of their judgment. I walked out of that office with my head held high, not because I had punished them, but because I had finally given myself the justice they refused to give me. That evening, after the will reading, I sat in my quiet kitchen with a cup of tea cooling between my hands. The house felt different somehow, lighter, freer, as though a great weight had been lifted from its walls. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel suffocating, it felt peaceful. I thought back to the countless nights I had sat here alone, staring at the worn wood of this very table, waiting for a phone call that never came. The loneliness, the doubt, the nagging question of whether I had failed as a mother. I had carried that burden far too long, but now, after everything, I understood. It wasn't my failure, it was their choice. They chose distance when I reached for closeness. They chose excuses when I asked for help. They chose greed when I still longed for love. And so, I made my choice. I knew Emily and Robert would never forgive me. Perhaps in their eyes, I had betrayed them. But what they could never see, or never admit, was that they had betrayed me first. The day I called with pain in my chest, and heard only cold dismissal on the other end of the line, was the day I stopped waiting for their love to return. Instead, I found it elsewhere, in the kindness of a neighbor who saw me not as a burden, but as a person worth showing up for. Loyalty, I learned, doesn't come from bloodlines, it comes from actions. Some might say I was harsh, that I should have left something for my children out of obligation or tradition. But I ask, what is tradition worth when it is hollow? What is obligation when it is never returned? I didn't strip them of an inheritance. They stripped themselves of it, one neglectful moment at a time. I thought of Harold then, his voice echoing in memory. Make sure it goes where it'll be valued, Maggie. I smiled through my tears, whispering into the empty room. I did, Harold, I did. The truth is, I never wanted revenge. What I wanted was dignity. I wanted to leave this world knowing that what we built, our home, our savings, our legacy, would not be squandered by hands that only saw dollar signs, but cherished by someone who understood the meaning of loyalty. Emily and Robert may never understand that lesson. They may walk through life bitter, convinced I wronged them, but I know deep in my soul that I did what was right. In the end, I kept my promise to myself. When they told me to figure it out myself, I did. I figured out my future. I figured out my legacy. And I figured out who my family truly was. And when the time came, I erased the rest.